Boo-boo. Hi everyone, Animally friend Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Pile album, You're Better Than This. Pile is a Boston-based indie rock and post-hardcore band. This is their fourth full-length album, I believe. They've been at it since the late 2000s. I stumbled upon them in 2012 through their album Dripping, one of my favorite rock records of that year for its punk ferocity, its jagged guitar riffs, its guitar playing, which actually had quite a bit of character, the weird, winding, twisting songs on this record too. Here, when the band would go aggressive, there were some clear influences coming from groups like Husker Du and some Fugazi and maybe some Shellac too. But what set Pile apart from those bands and other bands that copy those bands were the over-the-top vocals of frontman Rick McGuire, as well as some of these songs and just melodies hiding underneath some of this aggressive rock instrumentation, because there were actually some memorable lyrics and some memorable songs beyond the volume of the band, especially on tracks like So Hard, which through the picked guitar arpeggios showed a little bit of a folk influence. And if you've heard Dripping, maybe you'll like this new album of Pile's as well, because it doesn't really sound like they've done much of anything to change up their sound. Now, don't get me wrong, there are most definitely some changes going on here, but they're incredibly subtle. Maybe the band sounds a little bit louder, maybe there's a little more reverb on the vocals, the reverb sounds brighter, a bit sharper, though it doesn't exactly help the vocals at all, which a lot of the time I find to be kind of buried behind the slightly pumped up guitars. I think this record might be a little more aggressive than Dripping in some respects, but stylistically though, the band really is the same group you might remember from several years ago, which is fine if they continue to deliver good material. Though I was kind of hoping they would change things up at least a little bit on this album, considering that, you know, even though I do like Dripping, it doesn't have the most original sound on the block. What really made that record appeal to me was just that it had good, solid songs and great performances. But I don't think this new album over here has as much of that. I think this time around, Pile is a slightly less dependable band, more unpredictable in a sense, more prone to intense mood swings. We will get into that in a second, though first, I do want to give this album props for having some of the best song titles I've seen on any record this year. Appendicitis, number 2 hit single, The World Is Your Last, and the 1-minute acoustic interlude, Fuck the Police, which is actually incredibly well written and performed, and one of my favorite tracks in the track listing here. And this track is an incredible contrast to how the album actually starts out, with an incredibly loud flurry of staccato guitar chords. The snare drums sound like pistols going off, vocals are all frenzied, going insane. The whole song is really punchy, really in your face, but it's really all kind of a blur, too. And there are aggressive moments in Pile's back catalog, but on this album, there's just something kind of unfocused about it. Like, if you took away the volume, if you took away the energy, there really wouldn't be much of anything there. Or if there is something there, it's kind of difficult to decipher with how buried the vocals feel a lot of the time. And I feel roughly the same way about a lot of the louder, more aggressive tracks here, like number 2 hit single. The slower, drearier tracks are really where some of the album's best tunes shine through, even though they're filtered through these really heavy, slow, dreary, depressing guitars, like the song Mr. Fish, which has some of the weirdest lyrics on the entire LP. Rick seems to be kind of singing from the standpoint of a character on this track. There's a really anthemic build toward the end of the song that's pretty nice too. I also dig the incredibly slow and heavy sonically and emotionally Hot Breath. There is not a single song on this record that is as dismal and I think just as wallowing in its sadness as this track. And for the most part, I dig the really big finish of this album too. It's a 7-minute track, Appendicitis, kind of strung out guitar chords at the beginning of this track following a slightly folky progression. Then all of a sudden the guitars get heavy, the song just changes pace, changes flavor. It starts building, intensifying. There's a really weird break of silence with like some vocals left over from just the studio recording just not being cut out, and the song eventually finishes with this huge explosion of just noisy, twangy guitar leads. There are definitely highlights on this record. Pile still sounds like a very capable band. The performances on this record, for the most part, are still very tight, but I just can't help but feel like this record is just a tad too aggressive. And it feels weird saying that because I love the fact that a lot of rock music is really visceral. But after repeated listens, the loudest and craziest parts on this album just weren't anything more than an unmemorable rage. And it could be the mixing, the compression, maybe a little bit of the reverb too, but I felt like I spent more time than I should have on this record just trying to decipher what was going on. And not necessarily because any of the playing was overly technical or anything like that, but I felt like the guitars and the vocals were constantly clashing, which were both being bodied all the time by just how loud the drums were. Just feels like Pile kind of switched up their production style a little bit to something that just didn't really complement them as well. And I think it made a lot of the material here less enjoyable than it could have been. I'm feeling a light to decent 6 on this album. Tran?
Zishin, if you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Pile, forever.